Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Kyle Crone, Senior Manager of Regional Marketing here at Exclaimer, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We're here to talk about a shift that's affecting both IT and legal teams. Regulatory attention is moving further into day-to-day communication governance, not just incident response. Email is still central, but it now sits alongside messaging platforms, collaboration tools, mobile communication, and AI assisted content. Those channels are being used more widely and they're being reviewed more closely. That creates a challenge. Policies may be clearly defined, but enforcement across systems, devices, and regions is often inconsistent. That gap is where risk starts to build. In many organizations, teams are expected to show how communication is controlled across systems, but don't have a complete view of how that's actually happening. So, today we're going to look at how that gap forms, where it creates exposure, and what it takes to manage communication in a way that's consistent and defensible. I'm joined by two experts who bring different perspectives on this. First off, we have Alex Dennis. He's an information security manager here at Exclaimer. He focuses on security operations, threat detection, and compliance from an IT standpoint. Hi, Alex.
Hey, how are you, Kyle?
And we also are joined by Ed Bodie, who is our general counsel. Hi, Ed.
Hi.
Um, he works on regulatory, commercial, and governance challenges and brings a legal perspective on how communication standards are assessed and enforced. So let's kick things off. Alex, I'll start with you. From what you're seeing, how has the scope of communication risk changed over the last few years?
This is a great question to kick us off. So I will say that I think the main change in what we see in this risk is how distributed communication has become. So, to elaborate that better, it's no longer just an email on what we use as a main source of communication driver. We have multiple messaging platforms. We have multiple collaboration tools, mobile access. I mean, all that to say is we have all these multiple systems being used at the same time, which is a huge scope to, just kind of keep track of. And within each of those systems, each system is handled differently with how communication is used. So the policies, even though they do exist, they are often applied in different ways, depending on the platform, depending on the context. So that's kind of where the issue starts to rise. And you may have noticed, we consistently have controls in place for emails, but less so much visibility within the messaging tools. And in some cases, communication also move into tools that sit outside of proof systems. And naturally, this create gaps in visibility. It makes it harder for us to understand where communication is being handled over time. And over time, these gaps just build up naturally. And it's not because the policies are not in place, like we have that, but it's just because they're not being enforced consistently across all platforms. And given how fast-paced technology is moving nowadays, we may have one that comes around in like last month that may gets approved, and then we have a new trend that comes up the next, in this month that we have to now be on top of and look over it. So these gaps are becoming more significant as communication is rising just across all these systems as we are reviewing them. And so as more tools are being introduced, these gaps are becoming harder to track. So from an IT and InfoSec perspective, the challenge, to maintain these across all systems, they just weren't designed to be managed together.
Yeah, Alex, I think that makes a lot of sense. Even when policies are defined, applying them consistently across, large scale companies or complex systems is becoming more and more difficult. Ed, from a legal perspective, how does that change how communication risk is assessed?
Yeah, so I think as Alex has touched upon, there's a lot of different factors coming in from the different channels that we're now seeing. And I think it's important that risk is assessed across all those business communication channels and not just fully focused on email. I think we're seeing an increased focus on this recently. We're looking at the ways that some companies are now starting to look at risks that are traditionally associated with email now being seen through other channels such as Teams, Zoom, and Slack. And it's the inconsistency between systems that can increase exposure during audits and investigations. And legal risk is sort of managed in a sort of series of ways, one of which is documenting where your risk is, seeing whether you address it by policy, then the key of education and making sure your staff are aware of that policy and how their roles fit into the implication of it, and then looking at the system controls and audits that come after it. And so in each of those situations, it's important that businesses are starting to look at risks that have been traditionally associated with one method of communication now actually being attributed to those other channels too. The other point that Alex touched on around new systems that are coming into play, I think that risk has been there for a while, but I think this is now also focusing on the use of systems by people that are outside of those that are approved by the business. And now that there are so many avenues for communication, be those on mobile phones, be those on their laptops, whatever it may be, it's the having the awareness within the business of where staff are communicating and where those grey areas may be in the communication and control. And so, as Alex also touched on it, it's then becoming harder from a legal perspective to evidence how those policies are being applied consistently. And it's important to remember that whilst it may be becoming harder, organizations' positions legally are still to have those policies in place, educate their staff, and show that those policies are meaningful in practice. So the challenge isn't just about defining policy, it's a challenge in showing it's applied consistently.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to reiterate, because I think it's important, like you said, the challenge isn't just defining policy, it's like you said, yeah, showing that it's applied consistently across every channel when it's being reviewed. Okay, so the next question is what those gaps actually lead to in practice, especially when communication is reviewed. Ed, where do you see the risk materialize from a legal perspective?
So there's a number of risks that can come about in terms of communications that are outside controlled systems. So you have a risk of data loss, you have a risk of IP loss. Um, to some extent, sometimes you could have a loss of the real control of the business's core assets, potentially. I mean, they're the worst case scenarios. But if we're being more realistic about it, then the risk tends to surface during an audit or during an investigation. So failure to make sure that these positions are being consistently applied may lead to a loss of an audit standard or may lead to certain audit findings that then have a business cost associated with them. You then move to a different scenario where you could look at data laws and regulations and looking at whether a business is properly describing how the data that it handles in that channel is being handled and processed and being transparent with the recipient of the message. And let's not also forget that there are other requirements around business communications. So that may be the identification of the sender of the message, legal disclosures or disclaimers to recipient organizations about the nature of the communication, or things that actually apply to the sender. And organizations need to be alive to these other channels to make sure that all of those requirements are being met consistently across all the channels. And then you also have other legal obligations around the accessibility of communications. And so organizations need to be alive to things like the Equality Act or Americans with Disabilities Act and thinking about how their digital communications are landing with recipients. So as I've already said in response to the first question, I think it's relevant here as well. A lot of this comes down to education around staff and then putting the right systems in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on the other side of the coin, Alex, from an IT perspective, where do these issues tend to show up?
I would say they usually show up within I mean, just visibility and control. And I guess you kind of expand on that better. Whether you're Gmail or Outlook, right? We understand from, as IT professionals that these are our number one source of communication needs to be locked down first, right? So we have policies defined for those. However, we have less oversight in the terms of something that needs more immediate instant messaging that we just have less oversight over these type of software and platforms for mobile communication, right? So like Slack or Signal, given an example, right? And another example where, even though emails are very tightly controlled, messaging tools are not so much within that same level of scope and standards of, just in the policy sense that because they're being used a lot more informally, right? And so because they're being used a lot more informally, we just don't give that same level of attention and enforcement to those. Or when updates, to policies are being made centrally, when you do have to review these policies on a as needed basis, um, you know, even though they're applied manually in so many other different systems, so they often don't stay aligned to what these policies are usually established as. And in some cases, I mean, communication just happens in systems that are just not really fully governed. And it kind of goes back to my point of it's hard to keep track. It's hard to retrieve information as well when it's needed. And this creates gaps, situations within this that communication just doesn't meet the same standards across all process and all systems. And so when that happens, it's difficult. I mean, it's really hard to show where these policies are being applied correctly, what's in scope and what's out of scope, right? And from an IT and InfoSec perspective, it's not that the challenge is hard. It's not the enforcement that's the challenge. It's just being able to demonstrate our security controls, our gaps. How do we, identify that, and how do we remediate them, and how do we explain that, across all systems when they are identified, when they are being examined.
So it sounds like both from a legal and IT standpoint, the challenge is the same. It's being able to show that communication is controlled in a consistent way, not just in one system, but I think, like you both mentioned, across all of them. Um, so we've looked at where gaps appear and how they show up when communication is reviewed. The next step, I feel like, is understanding what organizations are expected to demonstrate when that happens. So, Ed, when regulators or auditors look at communication, what are they actually expecting to see?
So I think this is one where security and legal work quite closely together. Um, this will be one where you're shaping the policies together. You're talking about the legal risks that need to be reflected in those policies and making sure that those are addressed. Um, Making sure those policies exist, that there is evidence that they're being applied consistently. So this comes down to a lot of what Alex was just talking around in terms of being aware of where the threats exist. And then it's making sure that those policies aren't just being paid lip service. So it's not that they just exist in a file somewhere that's pulled out annually to show to your auditors, but it's making sure that they are lived and breathed by the organization. And that comes down again to the point that I've touched on in terms of education, making sure there's a record of how these policies are updated, making sure there's a record on how they are surfaced with staff, and making sure that high risk areas of the business are perhaps more regularly reminded of how these policies play into their day-to-day activities. Because I think for a business to really be in a strong position on this, it's got to have its own confidence that those controls are in place. And again, that comes back to then being confident when being audited, when carrying out an investigation, that those areas of risk are actually already addressed.
So then, Alex, from an IT perspective, how does that translate into day-to-day operations?
From a day-to-day operations, it's, going back to my earlier points, it's just how these policies are consistently implemented across all systems. If controls are applied differently depending on the platform, it just becomes a lot more harder and difficult to really maintain consistency across all of these platforms. Over time, systems drift. Some become obsolete while some adapt to the new technologies. As you're maintaining with just this new generation of technology, it becomes a lot more difficult to maintain consistent with that. It just drifts, and we all know that, or at least it becomes harder to know whether communication is meeting the same standard everywhere, right? And so the focus is, when we apply these policies in a consistent way, across all systems, rather than managing them separately. It just it also affects just how updates are being handled, right? I mean, we have security owners or just owners in place that handle these different variety of controls. When requirements change, when an audit were to come up, right? I mean, there could be something as different as yesterday it comes out with the new news when it comes to a framework that does change the process how it goes moving forward. And so these changes just have to be consistent and apply. And just more importantly, you just have to stay on top of the current new trends in order for all systems, to be applied with the policies and new framework and controls to be consistent across the board. So when you do these updates manually, that is how you create you set yourself up for things to be falling out of sync, things for uh, just not things being in order. And going back to that point of yes, everything is changing at a fast pace. So many things to keep track of. Visibility is another factor. And you need to be able to see how communication is being handled across all systems. You need to be able to see how these evidence may change too as these new controls emerge, when we review them, how to get the evidence for that, and how to get, how do we implement it, right? More importantly. And so from an InfoSec IT operational standpoint, this reduces reliance on manual processes and you make it easier for the IT audience to keep this standard consistent.
Some key themes that I'm pulling out from both you and Ed, it's about consistency, visibility, and being able to show how policies are being applied across systems when that's examined. And that's where IT and legal need to be aligned. Legal defines what's required, and IT ensures those requirements are applied consistently across the organization. So I think we can all be in agreement with that. So we've talked a lot about why this is really important, but I think it's important to look at now how organizations put this into practice. So I'd love to hear from both of you your best, tips, best practices, insights. Alex, where do teams typically start from an IT perspective?
We start with identifying where the gaps are. We perform a gap analysis within what is in scope. We want to make sure that we identify within those gaps what is inconsistent to what has been previously done, right? And a lot of these environments and what's in scope, I mean, the policies are defined centrally, right? And but what you say can be implied in so many different ways depending on the system. This creates a whole variation of, you know, controls and things to kind of keep in mind. And over time, as you scale, right, as you get bigger, these variations become more difficult to manage. So when I take a step back, my initial approach is to always, look at it as let me go ahead and audit our systems from an internal perspective, look across all the systems, what is in scope, what's been approved, what's been not approved, right? What are the do's and don'ts? And then cross that over and identify, what the differences are after performing a gap analysis. And then from there, we standardize these with how these policies are enforced. So, as I say that, it doesn't mean that we're changing these systems, but we are looking at these systems as we are consistently applying an approach to this on how communication is being handled from a company established point. And so that's on the communication side of it, right? On the other part of that topic is, reducing reliance, manual processes. Can we even automate some of these processes, right? And if updates, truly depend on individual teams, departments, right, making these changes across all of our different systems, it's difficult to keep everything aligned consistently. How do we centralize these updates? Well, that is where I want to say is centralizing these updates, promoting transparency is what makes this approach with compliance a lot more reliable. And as I bring up the update point, so it comes around the visibility, right? We want to be transparent with this. We want to be transparent with our approach as we implement new changes. We need to be able to see how communication is being handled across all systems, no matter how big and no matter how small, because it will impact one individual at the bare minimum when you do these. So, being able to understand how communication is being handled across all systems, being able to understand how policies are being applied consistently and when they're not. That is when, in practice, on a teams usually approach this on a step-by-step basis, focusing on the biggest gaps first, and then working down to the smaller ones. So as time goes on, right, as that is improving, it does become easier, so much easier, really, to maintain these consistent standards of responding, to requirements changes occur.
Thanks, Alex. So it starts with identifying where things are inconsistent, then standardizing how policies are applied and making sure that's visible across systems. So now on the other side of the coin, from a legal standpoint, Ed, what matters legally when organizations take that approach? What are your tips, um, for how you would approach this?
Yeah, so I'm sure any lawyer would tell you that one of the things they hate most is having to update loads and loads of different documents. So I think once you found a solution, I think you're looking for something that enables you in one place to really manage this as much as possible. Um, that way, not only are you ensuring that there's consistency across the various channels, you're looking at actually only having to update language once or in one place. So I think that's a key driver for it. Um, I think also to some extent it's looking at the future. So another one of lawyers' jobs is often called horizon scanning. That used to be the phrase. And trying to look at what the risks are that are coming down the track. So here it's about being aware of not only legal changes that may be influencing what companies have to say and where they have to say it when they're communicating with people, but also looking at the type of technologies that are being developed and the risks that they pose and whether there's going to become an internal pressure to adopt those technologies. So you may be able to get ahead of things. It's been seen a lot with AI and the way that people rush to AI and start putting stuff in there, and legal teams often have to react and put guardrails around it or understand the controls that are then available from the vendor. So it's being ahead of these issues so you're not being in a reactive state to it. You're trying to be as proactive as possible. And then it comes back to the themes that Alex and I both touched upon about ownership of those standards, giving staff some role and understanding of what their role is in terms of owning the standards and how they communicate. Um, and then the consistency of it and demonstration of how those controls play out. But I think the other key thing to remember is, as Alex has talked about, identifying these gaps is a key thing. But some of that comes around to actually making sure that the controls that you have in place already still remain relevant and still remain reliable. So not just saying, are they there, but actually, are these still the right controls?
So we've looked at how communication has expanded across systems, where gaps start to appear, and how those gaps show up when communication is reviewed. And we've covered what organizations are expected to demonstrate and how they can start to bring more consistency and control across their communication environments. The common thread across IT and legal is consistency and visibility. It's not just about defining policies, it's about being able to demonstrate how those policies are applied and maintained over time. Before we move into questions, I'd like to get a final perspective.
Teams need to focus on first by understanding where communication is not aligned. And a secondary point to that as well is understanding who owns what in part of the communication process. So this usually means that looking across the different systems that are established and approved and identifying within those approved softwares, systems, just processes, right? If these policies are being applied differently, if they are in scope and not a scope, and or if there isn't much clear visibility that these were applied. And a good example that Ed brought up earlier is AI, right? AI is such a fast-paced field, to talk. It's a very good one, but we may have a policy established today, and that tomorrow could be completely different, and how do we ensure that we are adapting to those communication? How do we ensure that we are adapting to, the owners to ensure that this gets distributed and communicated out easily? And so, using off, I'm going off of example, right? Once you have that established process, it does become so much easier to prioritize what needs to be done, the what, the why, and the who moving forward.
Amazing. And Ed, your perspective?
Yeah, I agree with Alex that the understanding where the gaps are is the first point. And then it's about moving meaningfully through the other steps of identifying the policy controls, education, demonstration, and consistency. It's following that whole story through that each time you're breeding confidence across the organization and confidence when you're engaging with regulators and auditors.
Amazing. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Ed. Um, right, let's move into some questions. All right. So, I think this is a good one for you, Alex. Where do organizations typically struggle most when trying to enforce communication policies?
It's it's consistent across all systems, and that is assigning ownership. Who will be the one taking ownership to ensure that these communication takes place, within your department or within your team? And how does that get this displayed across the board to all companies and, for both internal and external? So this kind of dives onto my point of policies just have to be defined clearly. They have to be consistent with the language. And just because they are applied maybe differently across the platform, at the end of the day, communication is key, right? Yeah, emails might be tightly controlled, but messaging tools, not so much, right? They rely on more local teams or manual processes or, however it's been approved in the process, but they are within a scope of, just a smaller team handling that. This does create differences in how communication is handled on a day-to-day basis. And over time, as we adapt to, new tech, right, new trends, these differences build up a lot faster than you can think about. And so it does become difficult, just maintaining that consistent standard across the board. The challenge so much isn't really about defining the policy, but just more so how do you apply it in the same way without adding more complexity, right? How do I make sure that as a team member to another team member, right, make it easier for you to communicate with this and why this is important, why it needs to be addressed, and how can I help you to make sure that I can achieve your goals doing that?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, governance is really important, but how do you educate your staff, your teams on that consistently? And especially with today's day and age, there's so many messaging platforms. You have to constantly update that list of things to manage. Okay, Ed, I'll bring you in on something related to that. How should organizations think about communication outside approved systems?
Um, yeah, so we've touched on it a little bit through this webinar. I think that there's a number of competing challenges. There's the pace of change, which I think we can all agree is shows no sign of abating and just gets faster and faster at the moment. I think there's also the challenge, particularly in sales-led businesses, where you want to be where your customer is or where your prospect is. So you want to be communicating with them in the ways that they're potentially comfortable. So I think some of this comes down to the sector or the kind of organization that you are and the pressures that you have in terms of where you're being expected to communicate. But I think more broadly, organizations do need to be very mindful about new communication methods coming on stream. And as I said before, and as Alex has touched upon as well, we need to look at the way that, for example, the AI services have come out of nowhere really as far as most businesses go. And the challenges they've put on around IP control, data control, confidential information, and things like that. So using communication methods outside of those that organizations are already comfortable with, it fundamentally creates gaps in oversight and can create business risk. Um, it's not necessarily just in the communication itself, but it's also in auditing, record retention, being able to pull things back, being able to comply with legal obligations that you may have around your record keeping. And so unapproved systems really start to undermine the ability to demonstrate that policy control and that consistency that we've talked about. And that can then create exposure in the worst case scenarios. So organizations really need to decide how those channels are governed or restricted within their own business operations. And that may be proactively, as we've talked about, in terms of looking at what's coming and saying, actually, we're not going to move into this space. Or it may be reactive. You might find out that certain people in your organization are using a particular method of communication and decide to say that's not allowed. Or it may come to light if someone says, hey, there's this new system. I'd really like to use it in my area of the business. Is that okay? And that should normally kick off a flow of security review, legal review, and working out whether it's something the business wants.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good shout. Right, another one for you, Alex. What does being audit ready actually look like in practice?
Hmm. I would say what's been great when you ask this question, right, is that recently at Exclaimer we just were able to recertify ourselves with our SOC 2 and ISO 27001 standards. And one of the key lessons that I've learned when being audit ready for, just when the audit does come up is, I mean, what's been consistent across this call is communication, right? Being honest, right, with yourself and with the auditor, because the way I look at it is it's a two-way street on how they want to help you, right? They wanna be able to help you just as much as I want to be able to, help out with my team on making sure that we are audit ready, compliance ready to ensure that trust is established across the board from all various sorts of companies. And this ties down to one key principle is communication, right? Is can we be honest with ourselves and communicating our gaps? Can we be honest with ourselves and establishing a plan to remediate these gaps? And can we be honest in displaying this to the auditors once that time comes? So when you identify these gaps, it's across all systems. It's not just in one platform. This includes how the policies are established, how they're applied, how they're maintained, and how are they being consistently enforced to ensure that when updates are rolled out, it is following update procedures of the communication aspect and the maintenance aspect. You just have to be able to show that communication is happening by logging it, by communication when you present the evidence to the auditor at the time, right? But that's just so important with communication just across the board. I mean, it's just nice being transparent and understanding where, what the bad news are, what the good news are. Like, because at the end of the day, you just know that this is news that you received and you can, you do what you will with that information and move forward with that and making sure that these gaps are ironed out. If the visibility is not there, I mean, then Kyle and Ed, like, how would I know how to help you, right? How would you guys even know to help me if there's a time when an auditor were to come and they're asking something that I just, don't know how to handle that, but you guys may have the expertise to help me out with that. So that's how it becomes difficult to respond when information like that is requested, especially across all systems.
Okay, so well then follow up to that. If teams don't have visibility, which that's very possible, where should they start?
Start with meeting with respective team members. Start with understanding how the current communication is right now, if it is even a gap, right? And then just go from there. How can we establish this to make it consistent across all systems? Is it a Slack versus Teams? Is it a Gmail versus Outlook? Find a solution where this is what's the all-in-one solution. This highlights the systems that are governed super well and others that are not governed well. Once you identify that, then you can kind of go off with identifying the policies that were maybe in place at the time. You review that and just to see, if it's a Microsoft versus Google, right? And if it says Google in the policy, we'll make sure now it's Microsoft and make sure that when you do that, it is consistent with how this is being communicated across the board. I understand that, easier said than done, right? Most teams don't try to fix everything at once. There's so many other problems we gotta actually handle, right? But at least just taking up the ownership of that and identifying that and communicating that, you just kicked off the domino effect right there of what may have started off as a hard work to do. Well, you just made it so much easier communicating that to your folks. And then you focus on the areas on what carries the most risk, what is a liability, and what is the least amount of control we can maybe put work on. And you just kind of work from there as a team, as a collaboration. The approach makes this so much more manageable. It helps build consistently. You help build trust internally and externally. And, you just make everyone's lives easier by collaborating like this.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I think we have time for one more. Let's see. Ed, where do you see organizations get this wrong most often when it comes to communication governance?
I think it's a mixture of what Alex has just been talking about. I think one of the key things is really good alignment between legal and IT. So making sure that there's a tight link between those teams, and particularly where issues are fast moving, or under sort of a regular cadence of review from a tech perspective. Um, I think it's important that legally you don't just write a policy and leave it alone. And in today's world, maybe even like an annual review might not be regularly enough. It may be having different cadences for different policies. Um, and I think it is to some extent who's leading who is also a key thing to work out. A legal leading IT or IT leading legal. It could be a flavor of all, but that's why the communication between those teams is really key. Um, and I think it's also building in the right reviews. So when a new communication platform comes on, that the right people are involved in signing it off. It's not just gets signed off by one part of the business and forgets about potential legal ramifications of it, because that's where the risks that we've talked about and those gaps that we've talked about come into play further down the line. And that also brings me back to the point around if you can find tools that help to do things across all platforms or across multiple channels and help you govern them in one place, then those sorts of tools really, really lead here, because they provide that ease and consistency, and confidence that that policy is across multiple areas.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, that's the end of our webinar. Just to quickly recap, one of the themes that have come through today is the importance of being able to show how communication is managed across systems, not just how it's defined. That's where IT and legal need to work closely together, especially as communication continues to expand across multiple platforms. Many thanks to Alex and Ed for sharing their perspective, and thanks to everyone who joined us today. We'll be sharing the recording of the session along with some additional resources so you can explore this in more detail. Thanks once again, and we'll see you on our next webinar.
Bye, everyone. Thank you again.